had very limited arable land and fresh water supplies. This meant that crops were farmed mostly for local consumption, and as such, the backbone of the Caymanian economy was actually seafaring. Seafaring began with turtling, which at first was abundant in local Cayman waters, but as local resources became depleted, seafarers were forced to wander further and further from home. By the 20th century, however, seafaring transitioned from turtling to manning merchant ships, and Caymanian men were off to sea for months and even years at a time.
We talk about having a matriarchal society in the past, but I really don't think that we had a matriarchal society in the true sense, because women didn't have control of all different aspects of society, whether it was politics, business, education, whatever. We had a matrifocal society, but not a true matriarchal society.
We have men who went off to sea for extended periods of time, and the women who were left here essentially had to step up and take on roles that were traditionally held by men in order to ensure the smooth running of their families, of the community, and of the country as a whole. And that is a tremendous thing and something that we need to acknowledge, but that's normally where we end the conversation. We don't often discuss the fact that we had traditional gender roles that were very near and dear to our hearts that were challenged by that very reality of having men leave and having women take on jobs that were held by men, or positions and duties that were normally held by men.
Men have maybe been on ships for very long periods of time. They come back and they maybe are accorded almost like king-like status. And in that, where you have persons who might be prone towards perpetration, something like that would make it even more difficult than normal to express those concerns, because on the one hand, you're so happy to have your male folk back, and on the other hand, there may be things that are happening that are not appropriate, but yet you don't want to ruin this time of celebration. And when you pair that with the shame that's just associated with abuse, that creates a dynamic that is very, very difficult on your own, standing as an individual, to address without the necessary resources to do so.
And this is where, for those men who are already prone to perpetration, this is where we're seeing the focus then shift to the children in the home, the female children and the male children, and that's where we're seeing some of the roots of the problem.
It's almost an inheritance, so to speak. I've only been a social worker for a number of years, for about 4 years, and in that short time, I was dealing with clients from various different age groups. And in each one of those age categories, there was some level of exposure to sexual abuse. I'm dealing with my adolescent clients, and then when speaking with the parents who are in their 40s, let's say, they are telling me stories of what happened to them when they were a child, how they were abused by uncles, how they were abused by their own parents or family friends. You know, so it's not fair to say that it's something that's imported. I know that some of that would exist based on the high transit population that we have here. However, it is so deeply rooted in our history that would be a very inaccurate statement.
If the male children weren't themselves being sexually abused, they then begin to witness the abuse of sisters, cousins, and nieces and the other young women in the home. And in that, we've already sort of established a sense of normalcy as far as the behavior and expectation that this is just the way that things are within the family setting. And that's a very dangerous precedent to set.
What I've noticed is that you would have a family where it happens, and say let's focus on child sexual abuse. Let's say there's a father who's molesting the daughter in the home. The sons, they see this, they know what's happening, they start to think it's normal. They may either grow up to molest their children or molest other children, or they may begin to molest the victim in the home. I've actually seen cases where that has been the situation.
Let's get one thing straight, Cayman.
A child cannot
seduce an adult.
I don't care how she walks, talks, or acts. If she's not 18, she is a child.
I am a child.
And your husband, brother, boyfriend, baby daddy, pastor,
Grandfather,
minister, boss,
police officer,
gardener, uncle,
father,
should have known better.
There's only one child in that scenario, and he isn't it.
He hath founded it upon the seas. The motto of the Cayman Islands pays tribute both to our seafaring history as well as our Christian heritage. While to the outside world, Caribbean destinations are synonymous with freedom and lack of inhibition. The truth is that the Caribbean region is surprisingly conservative and traditional. This is an important factor to consider, as traditional values and adherence to gender roles and norms have been found to have a significant impact on sex crimes. More than 100 reports in the scientific and professional literature involving more than 35,000 subjects indicate that rapists, child molesters, incestuous parents, and sexually motivated murderers are typically very conservative in their sexual and social values, and sometimes more religious than average, suggesting that in many cases, traditional sexual morality is a contributing factor in sexual abuse rather
that we heard it growing up as children. And so when girls are basically socialized to not speak up and use their voice, they become vulnerable to child sexual abuse. Often as well, we should say that girls are often valued for the way they look, how their body looks and things like that. We socialize our girls to have value placed on their bodies. And so that also makes them vulnerable to exploitation as well.
For a long time, there was a really disturbing trend in which men in their 20s, 30s, and 40s used to take their lunch breaks at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And they used to go by the high schools and the fast food places, which is in the same quarter-mile stretch. And that's where they used to try to pick up new teenage girlfriends. This was also done for gang initiation. And it was the norm for a long period of time, and it took quite a lot of advocacy and trying to raise this as an issue. But we still see not as much as before, but you still see every now and then, the odd person out who is clearly not there to pick up a son or a daughter.
I think a common thing amongst Caribbean culture, which is Cayman has taken that on, is the acceptance of minors with older persons, the tolerance, I should say. Now, everyone knows it's wrong, but when they see it, they smirk at it, but nothing is really done because they tolerate it to a certain degree. So you'll have a 23-year-old guy who's picking up a 13-year-old girl from school, and even though everyone knows it's wrong, no one is saying anything about it because it's always happening, so they just ignore it.
As a nation, we have this tendency to try to differentiate ourselves from things that are happening in the wider Caribbean. And for whatever reason, we somehow want to establish that things are different in Cayman. And that's not always the case. So there's a trend, for instance, where there are men, fathers, who believe that it is their right to be the ones who initiate their daughters into sex. And that is something that we see in the wider Caribbean, but that we're also seeing here in Cayman. And it's important for us to acknowledge that, because we keep trying to separate ourselves and distance ourselves from the issue in so many ways, when there are the realities that are happening in the region that are also happening right here at home.
Child will come and disclose, make a report, is not believed. And there are many reasons, but two main ones for the mother choosing not to believe her daughter, one of which is financial. So let's say, for the sake of argument, this lady, the alleged perpetrator is the major breadwinner or the sole breadwinner in the home. So the mother, in some cases, will choose not to believe her daughter because she's very fearful about what will happen to the whole family. So that's one reason. And we have a growing concern, most of the councillors share this concern too, that in more and more cases, the mother is a foreign national and she wants to get her 7 years in so that she can become Caymanian, have her papers. So there's a tendency not to believe the daughter for that reason as well, and that's growing.
Jailbait is better than not fishing.
Anything after 12 is lunch.
It's grass on the field, time to play ball.
If she ready to bleed, she ready to breed.
I could teach her a thing or two.
You've heard it. Maybe you've even said it.
Or maybe you just laugh it off.
But if you don't say it's wrong, you make it okay.
It's not okay
for grown men to flirt with young girls.
It's really not okay
to take a lunch break at 3 p.m.
to go by the high school or fast food places.
To pick up a new girlfriend.
It's not okay to think that even if she might be too young,
nothing not gonna happen, cause this is Cayman.
It's not okay to turn our
children into fair prey
for men's sexual advances.
If she's underage, she's a child.
This is no joke.
Stand up and be a man.
Standing idly and silently by is no longer an option.
As one of the largest financial centers on planet Earth and one of the most developed nations in the Caribbean, the perception of wealth, both of and within the Cayman Islands, creates a unique vulnerability for our population, especially our young people.
Cayman is not immune to the keeping up with the Joneses mentality, and what we're finding is that as a community, as a society, we're becoming increasingly more materialistic. And what this is translating into, especially now that the divide between the haves and the have-nots is growing, is that we're finding that young people are, specifically young women, are getting into relationships with older men in order to be able to gain access to having some of these things. So whether it is the latest cell phone or new clothes or ride in a new car, these are things that we're seeing them trade sex for. On the flip side of that, we're also seeing where families, sometimes the single family homes who are struggling, and you have a parent or parents who are encouraging, again, young women to get into these relationships with older men, because that older man then becomes a provider to that family. So paying a light bill, paying a telephone bill, or giving that child lunch money or spending money, and this is encouraged as a way to sort of keep the family afloat. We won't call it what it is. We won't call it commercial sex work. We won't call it sexual exploitation of children, but that is in fact what is taking place.
Homophobia continues to be a problem in the Caribbean region. And while neighboring Jamaica is often at the center of controversy, Cayman too has made headlines around the world over the past 2 decades for incidents relating to the ban of a gay cruise ship to the arrest of a tourist for kissing his partner in public. Independently of what one's views may be on the topic of sexual orientation, this too plays a role in determining our young people's and especially our young men's vulnerability to child sexual abuse.
As a community, we haven't come to terms with the broad spectrum of sexuality and sexual orientation. And what we fail to understand is the fact that our homophobic tendencies put our young men at an increased risk for child sexual abuse. We have very different messages that we send to young men and young women. With our young women, we're very clear as far as, don't have sex until marriage, be pure, be virginal. With our young men, on the other hand, we tell them to spread their seeds far and wide with as many women as they possibly can, because we tend to think that this will somehow keep them from becoming homosexual. And the dynamics of sexuality don't work that way.
In regards to boys, I would say that because we often don't think of boys as victims, they become often the unheard victims because they become afraid to speak out, because boys aren't considered victims oftentimes in sexual abuse cases. And often there's the stigma of homosexuality when it comes to boys. If the male is a perpetrator, they don't want to be considered or labeled a homosexual.
Another area of vulnerability, and I would think that this would more go with our boys, even though I'm not deluded enough to think that our girls are not involved in gang activity as well, is the drug culture that exists. And again, this is not germane to Cayman, but it does exist in Cayman. And where we have broken families, or we have families that children don't particularly feel a part of, the way gangs are set up is it does create a sense of family. It creates a sense of belonging that all children, all people need. So that becomes very attractive. And of course, the force of threat for leaving this family also keeps them there. But what about the initiations that happen? What do those involve? And I've had occasion to work on a case where a young boy was sexually assaulted by another male, and that was an older child. It was not an adult. But again, we talk about sexual abuse not just being with adults, but with older, more powerful children. And that child was forced to have anal intercourse, and that child would have been part of the wider gang, and really was not interested in having a conversation with anyone external about what he had suffered. But again, having great concern about whether or not this meant that he was gay or he was homosexual. And that is another aspect of culture where the whole idea of what does it mean if there's a same-sex attraction. So for boys who may be being targeted by older men who are of that persuasion, they're not wanting to talk about it. They don't even want therapy, far less to go to the police to report it, because they do not wish to be associated with anything that smacks of being gay or smacks of homosexuality. And that right there opens up a really huge vulnerability for our boys. If indeed something is happening, or if indeed they are being targeted, they're not reaching out for help.
Even with young adolescents, males, it does exist where their first sexual experience may be with an older woman. And people don't realize how often that does happen. However, in our society, it's seen as a high five. It's a badge of honor. I was with an older woman, and so it's something that you gloat about, not something that people look at as, oh well, that shouldn't be happening. Someone's taking advantage of that boy. No, it's an award pretty much to be able to do that. So you walk around with your head held high, and as such, the females who would be inclined to that are also led to believe it's okay for me to do this because no one is going to say anything. You will quicker, even though it's hush-hush in our society, you will quicker find where male perpetrator would much quicker receive a consequence than a female perpetrator.
Being in the Caribbean, where men are told to, buck up and be a man, and to not show any type of emotion and all these different things. If it does happen to a young man, chances are he will be ridiculed if he says anything about it, where to a certain extent there is a level of compassion when it's a young girl. So I do think that, yes, there is that misconception in our society as well.
So essentially what we've done is that we have laid a seed that a man, a true heterosexual man, can never ever refuse sex with a woman. A man can never be raped by a woman. That a real man will never turn down a woman sexually. And that is incredibly confusing for a boy, because a child is not equipped to handle sex at that age. And the repercussions of that, the damage that is done, isn't limited solely to that experience. However many times it happens, it's not limited solely to that victim. Even our language betrays us. We talk about young men, boys, being initiated into sex by an older woman, and we never ever talk about the fact that that older woman raped that boy. We talk about it as initiation. This notion of the unspeakable evil, it's just something that doesn't make sense. I can't think of a single problem or social ill that is not made worse by silence. And silence is essentially the reason why we're in the situation that we are at in the first place. As adults, our fear of potential victimization, or the potential victimization that we will suffer if we stand up for a child, be it our own or another, is such that it keeps us from acting, and it keeps us from giving a second thought to the actual suffering that children who are being sexually abused are going through, quite possibly on a daily basis.
I'd like to speak to what the children have told me rather than give you my personal opinion, so forgive me for being anecdotal. I've had children say to me that they don't see the point in reporting given the length of sentencing. They don't see the point in reporting given the lack of sentencing. They don't see the point in reporting given the fact that they're removed from the family home and the perpetrator remains there.
I've seen families where it is prevalent within the family itself. Numerous family members are engaged in it. Numerous family members have suffered under it, and everyone knows what's happening. But they will go as far as to grab their children and close the door and lock themselves away when they know what's happening and pretend it's not happening.
All right, everybody. I know that was quite a lot to take in. And as you are hopefully processing all of this, I just wanted to take the time and give you a bit more of updated statistics that we have. As I mentioned earlier, that film was actually debuted in 2014, so that's going on 8 years. So, bear with me for 1 second. I will. Okay, so now to just share my screen one more time. And all right. So okay, so our updated statistics, which are the ones that I was speaking about. I'm just gonna give this a second just to see if this shows up well on Facebook, because we were having trouble earlier. So the local information that we have it's coming from 3 main sources. The first is the Adolescent Health and Sexuality report that was conducted by the Pan American Health Organization here in Cayman. The report was the information was gathered in 2012, released in 2013, and there were 955 participants, ages 15 to 19 in 12 schools took part in this. The second report that we'll be using is the National Drug Council's Cayman Islands Student Drug Use Survey, which was released in 2020. There were 3,478 participants, ages 11 to 18, in 16 high schools, and including the year 12 students over at UCCI. You'll see that the number of participants that we mentioned in the statistics later on in this presentation is smaller, and that's because the NDC split their tool, so that there was one that was done for years 7 and 8, and then others for years 9 through 12. So that's why you'll see that the number of participants is a little bit different. And of course, statistics that's coming from the MASH, which is the Multi-Agency Safeguarding Hub. So the things to note, and again, I apologize that I can't show this quite the way that I would want to, because it appears that Facebook doesn't like when we play presentations. From the PAHO Adolescent Health and Sexuality report, the first thing that stood out to us was the questions around first sexual experience. Out of the respondents, 48% had reported having had sex, and of those, as many as 3% reported first sexual experience by the age of 7. 5% of females and 11% of males reported first sexual experience by the age of 10. 9% of females and 22% of males reported first sexual experience by the age of 12. And overall, 75% of sexually active teens who responded in the survey reported having their first sexual experience before the age of 16. And for those who do not know, 16 is the legal age of consent in the Cayman Islands. So as you can imagine, especially as we're looking at the very young the participants who reported first sexual experience at a very young age, there are a lot of questions that come up when it comes to coercion, rape, sexual exploitation, and sexual abuse. Another aspect of the PAHO Adolescent Health and Sexuality Report that is of note is intergenerational sex, which is defined as children having sex with someone who is 10 years or more their senior. 4% of females reported that their first sexual experience was with someone who was 10 plus years older. 54% of females reported that their first sexual experience was with someone 1 to 5 years older, as did 22% of males. Looking at the National Drug Council survey, there were questions around sexual and physical abuse. Again, so you see that the pool is a bit smaller, 2,281 year 9 to 12 students. And 96 young people, or 4.2% of the respondents, reported having been sexually abused. Girls were more likely to report this compared to boys, with 6.3% of girls versus 2.2% of boys reporting having been sexually abused. When it came to physical abuse, we saw 308 children responding that they had been physically abused, or 13.5% of the overall respondents. And again, girls were more likely to report this compared to boys, with 21.9% of girls and 6.9% of boys. The impact of sexual abuse and neglect was such that students who had been reported being physically abused were 7.5 times more likely to have attempted suicide than those who did not report the physical abuse. And similarly, for those who had reported being sexually abused, were 5.5 times more likely to have attempted suicide. Now, the Multi-Agency Safeguarding Hub was established in 2017, and among other things, the MASH became the central hub for child safeguarding referrals. There were a number of different things, including the introduction of the Children Act in 2012, which established mandated reporters, and of course, with the MASH unit then being sort of the central point where all this child safeguarding referrals were done, we automatically saw increases from 2017 to previous years. So there were 491 child safeguarding referrals in 2017, which in and of itself was an 80% increase over the previous year. We saw that number climb in 2018 to 747, 1,036 in 2019. In 2020, we saw that go up to 1,146. We put an asterisk there because, as you know, due to the COVID pandemic, schools were closed in March, and therefore schools are one of the places where the greatest amounts of referrals actually come from. And if you think about it, based on the school closures, children would very well have been without having any interaction with anybody who may have been a mandated reporter or people outside of their home between March and essentially September when school reopened. Yet even with that closure of schools, we still saw an increase in the referrals. And the numbers for 2021 is 1,405 child safeguarding referrals. We were able to compare the 2 years that were sort of full years for in terms of the stats. As you can see, in 2019, in terms of putting the sort of where exactly those referrals came into as far as category, we saw 17% being referrals for emotional abuse, 7% for neglect, 26% for physical abuse, 18% for sexual abuse, and 32% for other or welfare issues. In 2021, we've seen a dramatic increase in emotional abuse, making up 42% of the referrals, 12% for neglect, 15% for physical abuse, 18% for sexual abuse, and then 13% for other welfare or behavioral issues. And I think that it's the last thing that I want to leave with you as I hand this over to Ayala for for the discussion part of this, is that using the 2019 statistics, because we have this, of the 1,036 safeguarding referrals that we saw, for all types of referrals, we saw that in 97% of the cases, the offender was known to the victim. For child sexual abuse and exploitation referrals in particular, we saw that in 90% of the cases, the offenders were known to the victim. And this is in line with the statistics that Darkness to Light Stewards of Children training and other international data and international training sessions. So to put it another way, in 90% of cases, the child knew and possibly loved the person who actually abused them. So, and I think that's one of the things that makes dealing with child sexual abuse so incredibly difficult. So what I'll do now is I'm going to hand it over to Ayala, who will go over the panel discussion guidelines, and then I'll stop sharing my screen and we will begin the panel discussion.
Thank you, Carolina. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. We will now start the panel discussions, and these are the guidelines. Any panelist who wishes to answer a question may do so. Participants are encouraged to submit questions and comments, including those who are watching us on Facebook. All questions must be submitted in writing to the moderator, which is me, and you will see we have another moderator, which is our volunteer Simba, so you can send questions to us. If you're watching us through Facebook, you can write your questions in the comments and we will pick them up from there. Questions may be modified for clarity, and questions that reveal personal details or breach confidentiality will not be asked for obvious reasons. So please, if you have questions, start asking them. We are here to answer you. I think, Caro, we do have one question that relates to all members of the panel. This documentary came out in 2014. As we watch it now again in 2022, what stands out the most to you?
You called on me, so do I start answering?
Let's maybe start with Sydney, as if I'm not mistaken, you were also part of the original documentary.
Sophia? Sophia, could you just introduce yourself before you answer?
Hi, my name is Sophia Chandler-Aline. I'm a child psychologist with Health Services Authority, and I was involved with the original documentary. I work day to day with children who may come through the MASH who need therapeutic support. And the thing probably that stands out to me about the documentary is that the conversation still seems quite as difficult when we're having them with persons outside of maybe your typical professional arena. I still think there's a lot of discomfort around just talking about sex, period. And then, of course, dealing with everything that comes up and is kind of in your face when you're dealing with sexual abuse. As the statistics we were just looking at highlighted, in many cases, the children who are being abused by people that family knows, that they know. And that's always part of the complication, kind of coming face to face with the reality that statistics do tell us that children are typically abused by people that they know and in some cases love. So I think the fact that persons are still trying to kind of get their heads around the fact that we can't just trust someone because we like them is still something that really stands out to me these 8 years later.
Okay, thank you very much, Sophia. We have another question here. What are some of the major gains that you have seen in child safeguarding in the last 10 years? I think maybe this one, if there's any specific panelists who would want to answer this one, please feel free to go ahead.
I'd be happy to answer that one.
Yes.
So my
yes,
name is Camila. Thank you. I work with the Ministry of Education, Program Manager for at-risk youth. And I do feel, although I hear what Sophie was saying, and it's true that some of the conversations are still very difficult, I think it's important to also acknowledge the fact that we have some of this game. You know, Charlene spoke to the Children Act, that the revision that came out in 2012, speaking to mandated reporters throughout youth serving organizations. And I think that that was really important for us to start educating people about their legal obligation to safeguard children. Along with that, there were changes with the Education Act in 2016. The Education Act was revised and the regulations came along in 2017, and we were able to add specific child protection sections to the Education Act and education regulations that made other things mandatory in addition to the reporting of suspected child abuse and neglect. We also have training that is required in educational institutions and making sure that there's comprehensive training that's happening before persons are hired to work in educational institutions and so forth, and a few other things in there that are really important as well. The establishment of the MASH, which Carolina mentioned in her presentation, was really important. You can see the upsurge in referrals that have come in since the MASH was established. So I think that is a gain. And training has improved significantly. You know, we started with Darkness to Light, which is a wonderful training. It was a children's training, but we have been able to do so much work so that we localize what we do here. And just the work that the Protection Criteria Group has done, you know, with the policy development workshop, to be able to help youth serving organizations who want to be proactive about having child protection policies in place. They're receiving that support through this partnership work that's happening with.
I'm going to do a quick summary of points just because your audio was coming in and out. But it's okay. So the main things, if I got them all, and then whatever I didn't hear, everybody else jump on. Sort of the main gains were the improvements when it comes to both the requirements for within education for teachers to be trained and receive the training, and the actual improvements as far as the training themselves. We started with, you know, the Darkness Light Stewards of Children training, but now there are the options of the Child Protection Unit and other training modules that education offers to schools. You know, the gains as far as the actual establishment of having the MASH being established, which I had mentioned before as well as just the legislation in terms of the perspective of ensuring that we actually have mandated reporters, and that, you know, getting people to come on board and be able to actually recognize their responsibility in law to report the suspicion, disclosure, or discovery of child abuse. I think I got everything, but if I missed anything, somebody else can jump on.
Too, just to Cindy Blakaitis from the Employee Assistance Program. What I'm seeing from as a service delivery level with adults and as a parent as well, what I'm finding is that there's a lot more discussion about different questions amongst parents regarding different practices with the different youth serving organizations, people raising the issues of what is the child safeguarding that's going on here? How will I know that my children are going to be safe? Is this where you'd recommend taking them? And I think there's a little bit more discussion going on since amongst the different, you know, within either schools or, you know, even peer groups of, the mummy groups, things like that. I think it is more of a topic of discussion now because of that we've been kind of pushing this forward.
Mm-hmm. Is any other member want to answer this question? If not, I have a question here for Laura. Given your area of work, what do you see as some of the most harmful outcomes of child abuse that the community is either unaware of or does not fully realize the impact?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Laura Almiskey. I am the HIV and STI Program Coordinator at the Health Service Authority. In regards to my line of work, we see obviously teenage pregnancy being a big issue in Cayman, with abortion being illegal here. If there's no means to go off island, if someone is not wanting to keep a pregnancy, there is a lot of teenage unwanted pregnancies that go on. Our women's health clinic at the Health Service Authority is very full, even not just with pregnancies, but with teenagers coming in and younger children coming in with infections as well, so sexually transmitted infections. Obviously, if the child that is under the age of 16, that's the age of consent, comes in with a sexually transmitted infection, that is more than just a medical issue of concern. They would be needing to be referred to the MASH unit, as both Carolina and Camila previously mentioned. Going along with that, obviously there is some sexual trauma that can stream into every corner of their life. So we see drop out of schools or acting out if they're developing other ways of trauma, depression, anxiety. The list actually can go on and on.
To further on this question, we have another question that's directed to you, Laura, is how many of these children and teenagers, adolescents that you encounter are inclined to make a report to the police?
I wouldn't be able to give you statistics. I don't know if, I don't work in the MASH unit, so I don't know if someone else would be able to give you the statistics from that department. But as a medical professional, we are all legally bound to report all instances.
I think maybe Sophia might be able, if not necessarily to give statistics, but I guess maybe speak to her work and sort of what she hears from young people when it comes to making that the referrals. Sophia, can I pass that to you?
Well, again, I wouldn't be able to provide like specific numbers, but just in terms of my work, the assumption almost always is that if a young person below the age of 16 is pregnant or has been sexually involved with an adult, or an older young person that is above that 16-year-old age, that they themselves will see it as an abusive event. And sometimes that's not the case. So I think the question was talking about the interest in kind of pursuing that criminally. And sometimes what you will find is that that young person does not have an understanding of why it is problematic, for example, for a 14-year-old to be sexually involved with someone who's 22. And in an instance like that, you might have a child who is reluctant to participate in an achieving best evidence interview or to provide information because in their mind, this is a legitimate, relationship with their boyfriend or whatever the case may be. So particularly in a case where the concern is not seen by the young person, because no one's probably educated them or they don't have the understanding as to why there's an age limit provided for when is it okay that you are able to kind of make that decision for yourself. Those would definitely be instances in which it would be a bit of a struggle sometimes to have that child cooperate with the process of an investigation. In other instances where you may have a child who is quite aware that the activity is wrong and what's happened to them is wrong, if indeed it's happened with someone that they love, or if it's happened with someone who they feel has power over them to influence their family or to influence what's going on further, you again will see a reluctance. If they feel like, this is going to upset mommy, for example, it's, stepdad or visiting boyfriend who's done this, and the child has an awareness that there's a dependence, whether that dependence is emotional or financial, that mom has on that person. You will find them necessarily wanting to talk about what has happened to them, but not wanting to maybe take that next step to have that investigated. Again, being a mandated reporter, I don't have an option but to disclose that. And once I engage with a child in therapy, one of the key things that I need to let them know is that there's some things that cannot be kept secret, and you itemize what those will be. So sometimes what I will get is a child telling you something has happened, but not giving you any information that is helpful. So something happened with a person, and the person might be someone who's over the age of 16. So they're being, in some instances, very careful not to provide you any distinguishing information for that person that they themselves either are afraid of or have their reasons for not wanting to provide that information, or who they feel that they are in a genuine relationship with. So those will be the instances in which you will find a reluctance, at least in my line of work, for a child to disclose and provide the information necessary to fully keep them safe.
And just to add from your original question, Ayala, about certain harmful behaviors and whatnot that we may not necessarily see, the sexualization of our children is an incredibly harmful behavior that we have yet to meaningfully address. Like, it comes up every now and then when something happens, whether it's carnival or something else that kind of is a bit more in your face. But the sexualization of our children is happening all the time. And the messages that we're sending them and what they're getting from us, and it's what makes it seem as if having these relationships with where there's this huge power dynamic imbalance, where they themselves cannot in fact consent because they are children. That's where this comes from, is the fact that we are sexualizing them. We are we're at the point where it is that we need to change the way in which not only do we talk about it's like empowerment and development in sex and sexuality, but also when it comes to that aspect of sexualization and identifying what is healthy sexual behavior and identity versus what it is things that are imposed on people and rob them of their humanity.
Okay, we have another question here. I think maybe this is more towards Camilla, but it wasn't specified for a specific person. Why doesn't the Cayman Islands have a national safeguarding policy or statutory guidance like the UK does? Basically, the question says that working together to safeguard children is a national document that ensures children's right for protection. And as a British overseas territory, it would be useful to reflect on how this document could help influence the change here. And what are the DES doing in regards to that here?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
My audio is coming in now. Okay. So with regard to national standards, it is something that is being worked on. It's on the radar when it comes to the government, making sure that there's something in place about ensuring that there are standards for all youth serving organizations. So I actually just had a meeting about that earlier today. And I know that it's something that, the government wants to push forward and they want to make work. Yeah. When it comes specifically to the question about what is the DES doing about that, I think they mean the Department of Education Services. So it's actually higher than the DES. It's at the Ministry of Education level. So the Ministry of Education does have standards for educational institutions to ensure that there are things in place to safeguard children. So all educational institutions are required to have policies in place. They're required to carry out comprehensive screening for persons that are hired to work or volunteer at educational institutions. Persons are required to have training. So we do have those standards, but at the moment, it doesn't really go beyond education. Could you hear me?
Yes. Okay. Is there anybody else who would like to answer this question, or shall we move forward?
Well, I've been a broken record for 10 years in talking about the fact that there are no national standards for youth serving organizations in the Cayman Islands. I mean, there's probably recordings of my voice saying this exact phrase for the last 10 years. And whereas, education has made all these gains, They have helped us as a group in terms of Protection Starts Here to be able to, for what we have put together as far as the policy development workshops that we have done with youth serving organizations who have wanted to meet best practices and international standards for safeguarding, and they have themselves come up and said, this is really important to us. So we've been able to build on what education has to ensure that we're all speaking the same language when it comes to this. But, you know, as it stands right now, this is very limited, as Camila said, to the education sphere. So the biggest thing and one of the biggest motivators for all of us who are part of the Protection Starts Here project is essentially summer camps. And the incredible vulnerability that we add on to our children every year between June and August when it comes to summer camps, because there are no standards when it comes to summer camps that are not being based off of educational institutions. So anybody can set up a summer camp. They don't need to have any kind of, you know, background checks, no training. You know, it's like there's nothing there that says that these are the safeguarding steps that you have to take before you are in charge of this very vulnerable little person. So, or whatever their age, you know, once done under the age of 18 and whatnot, they're still considered children by law. So yeah, so I think it's just to add that we still don't have national standards for all other non-educational youth serving organizations.
Thank you, Carolina. I'm getting a lot of questions that are all pretty much the same in regards to how law enforcement agencies treat reports or investigate reports on child sexual abuse. There's a question is, are they taking it seriously enough as far as investigations? Are police officers trained enough to be able to investigate cases like this in the manner that it should be, especially considering the fact that children are involved? And do the courts punish severely enough people who do get convicted for child sexual abuse? Sophia, if you maybe want to start answering this one.
I work in the MASH. I most certainly don't think that I'm the correct person to comment on whether or not you know, the police are where they need to be. I do know the colleagues that I work with, just in my interaction with them, do seem to take the cases that they're working with quite seriously. But there are a number of things that kind of come into play when you're looking at whether a case comes out with the result that you're hoping for, or that you feel whatever result you feel it should be. And that comes all the way down from initially recognizing that it's very possible for a victim, when they first quote unquote tell their story, for that story, especially when you're talking about a child, for that story to have some variation in it. There needs to be an understanding that there are times that children tell their story and then they recant. And then they come back and they maybe say, you know, well, that really was true, because there's a lot going on in the background for a child when they're going through dealing with a disclosure and everything else that will bring for themselves and then also for their family. So I don't think it would be fair to say that persons don't take it seriously. I would say that sometimes justice and what the law ends up doing at the end of that sometimes feels like different things, because it's not simply a matter of, you know, this child said X, Y, and Z. It's about whether or not it can be proven, whether it can be supported by the evidence that's available. So I think that it obviously is a very hot topic. It obviously is something where people can feel very, very strongly, and sometimes accord the fact that the result that they were hoping for didn't happen as a result of poor investigation or some failure along the line. But sometimes it's not quite that simple. Sometimes there are comments about, well, you know, I know this child was abused. Was the child medically examined and things of that nature? And, you know, whether or not a child is medically examined also has to do with when the child is disclosing that the issue happened. Because if a child says that they were sexually abused or assaulted, and that assault happened last year, then, you know, a medical examination is a very invasive thing. What would we be physically examining the child to find, right? We're not hoping to recover any biological material. That age-old idea that you're going to be able to tell whether or not a child is a virgin or not is very misguided. And it is an idea that people are quite confused about. When someone says, is the hymen intact? Persons are really confused about what that actually means. So there are just so many things that if you are not a professional medically, if you're not a professional in terms of the legal and criminal aspect of things, just on the face of it, it may look like, oh, someone messed up. But sometimes it's a lot more complicated than that.
And I think too that in terms of understanding what can you actually charge people with, and
Correct.
just like in the constraints when it comes to those things. I mean, like for instance, the crime of defilement, which needs to be revised. Like it's one of those things that just need to be revised, and we need to update a lot of different things, and that obviously then ties into what's happening with the courts. I do think that there's a lot more in terms of training, awareness, education that needs to be happening at all levels, and that includes with the courts, it includes with our MPs, so that people can fully understand this, so that when they are sitting down and kind of grasping what it is as far as when we're talking about, the laws themselves, or, what happens within a courtroom, right? This notion of, again, we've made some strides in terms of protecting children who have to give evidence and everything else, but it's just like, what else can we do? Because, you have to even safeguard kids after they disclose, during that process as well. So, and as was mentioned by Sue Tressiter in the film, that is still, when it comes to it's the inconsistencies that we see as laypersons, as far as the sentences that are handed down, that I think it kind of gets people asking these questions in terms of, how robust is really the system when it comes to protecting children. So all of these things are things that we should all be asking, and we need to be looking at this from a holistic perspective, so that when it's just like we can address the issues themselves, but absolutely everyone would benefit from more education, from more training, from updating, standardizing, and all of those things. That's something that our system needs overall.
Thank you, Carolina. Next question is addressed to Camila and both to Carolina. Protection Starts Here has maintained that its focus has been on getting adults to shoulder the burden of child protection instead of passing that responsibility on to children. What then is the benefit of having child safety lessons in schools for primary school children, like, for example, My Body is My Own?
Me first or you?
Yeah.
Okay. So it is the adult's responsibility to protect children 100%. But what we want to do is make sure that children have the information that they need, so that they know what's happening to them, what their boundaries are, and when to speak up about what's happening to them not being right, right? So one of the trainings that we have our staff take in education, there's a survivor in it that says that she was abused by her grandfather when she was very young, and she had no idea that what was happening to her was wrong. Because this is a person that loves her, this is a person that's supposed to be taking care of her, and this is just something that grandfathers do. How is she supposed to know if nobody is educating her about the fact that there are boundaries with our bodies, they're safe and unsafe, and unwanted touches and these things, right? So if that education isn't happening at home, it needs to be happening somewhere. And so it is also the adult's responsibility to ensure that they're giving children the tools and skills that they need to be able to come to adults for help when something is going wrong.
And from, I guess, from our perspective, because I'm very fond of the My Body's My Own child safety lesson, when we were envisioning sort of how do we do it, how do you build capacity? And if you look at it, it worked out really well. I'd like to, for us to be able to take credit exactly for how it did, though I think it just kind of, the pieces just kind of fit in, because we started by doing Darkness to Light Stewards of Children training, right? So in so doing, we educated not only the teachers, but then also parents, laypersons, in terms of understanding why exactly, it was important important to have this education and to ensure that you knew how to prevent sexual abuse. Then we added the My Body is My Own child safety lesson to ensure that independently of where on the sort of social economic scale a school or early education center was at, that they could have access to a lesson that was best practices and evidence-based and everything else, and very simple, but also that, ensure that kids were getting the correct message. And then as part of that lesson, we also included a poster, an individual poster in which kids would take home, and then the classroom posters, which would stay up after the lessons were done throughout the year. Because when you're talking about safe, unsafe, and wanted touch, those aren't just things that you use as it relates to sexual abuse. It's just like the playground rules, right? There are times in which there are unwanted touches there, or unsafe touches there, because somebody shoved somebody else. So there are these. So the way that it kind of came back full circle was that you start educating parents, teachers, and adults. You give tools to the school to be able to provide those messages to kids, and then you give kids that poster that they take home with them, and then encourage the same parents who kind of know what the benefit of this is to then have that conversation. So essentially it comes full circle as far as we're speaking language at home, one language at school, and hopefully as more youth serving organizations come on board, that will become the norm, because it's just a small way to try to shift the culture towards a culture of safety, by ensuring that people are speaking the same language and doing that. So I think that child safety lesson is a very important component when it comes to that.
Thank you, Carolina. Next question, which will also be our final one, is for Mari. Mari, Bobo and Titi were developed as a way to teach children about Caymanian culture and heritage. So why did you think that the characters would be a good fit for child safeguarding work?
Hi, this is Mari. I'm from SANS, and I do filming and animation. So Bobo and Titi was created not just for Cayman's culture and heritage. We wanted to educate children. Sorry, I'm just checking my note. Yeah, so so if any of you guys have a children, like I was observing my child, and he will just pay attention to kids' voice. Whenever kids' voice come from the TV, he just pay attention. And I thought that was a very good way to kind of inform children. And then animation will kind of help to soften, not to soften, but to break down for kids to easily understand with not just cartoon characters, with other visuals. And yes, and then for us, it's very privileged to work with this awesome group of people, because Bobo and Titi actually not just helping children in Cayman, but in other countries. And for example, we were contacted from the Red Cross, Swedish Red Cross, and then it was translated in Iraq language. And hand washing song and the health and hygiene episode was translated in Iraq, and it is showing in Iraq. And so that is very, very big for me, and it makes my heart very melt. I'm not sure if that was okay. Did I answer?
It was very much okay.
Thank you.
Can I jump in? Like Mari, I think like Bobo and Titi they're loved characters within the community, with children and adults as well. Because I hear even, when I talk about, other parents in the group and from schools, people that don't even know that I'm affiliated with this project and everything. And they talk about how, sharing different videos that, like you said, it's so important. Children learn when they hear like a childlike voice that they can relate to, and then they see the cartoon characters, and it's something that they can, again, they more easily understand it because the cartoon characters are speaking their language, they're speaking at their level. And I think, you know, Bobo and TV has evolved so much through the various projects. So I really, you know, it's so exciting that, you know, they're getting international exposure, not only for the for this project, for Protection Starts Here, but for the hand washing and other COVID related projects. So sorry,
Thank
just wanted
you.
to say they're amazing.
Thank you.
We do have a few more questions. Is there a sex registry in the Cayman Islands? If no, why not? Carolina, I think I'll let you start by answering this one.
I think everybody will let me just answer this one so that they don't have to get into the hot seat. So, okay, so there is no sex offender registry in the Cayman Islands. It is a discussion that has been happening for some time. Whether or not it's gaining traction, it's something I'm not 100% privy to. But I think what's important to realize when it comes to the sex offender registry is that the use that people associate with it, like a public sex offender registry, is one that actually has been shown in other places to do more harm than good. And I'll explain why that is. So when you're looking at a public sex offender registry, right, in terms of this notion of we need to know, and forgive me for just kind of speaking bluntly, we need to know where the perverts live, right? That's kind of the way in which people look at a sex offender registry, yeah? So imagine you're in a complex and you have a public sex offender registry, and you know that, you know, the people in apartments, you know, 8, 12, and 64 and whatnot are on the registry. Yeah, and it's just what gets missed when we're looking at public sex offender registries is, as you'll remember from the video and from the stats and everything else, in 90% of cases of child sexual abuse, the perpetrator is known to the victim. Yeah, so we don't give access to our children to the person who is a little bit off, right? To the creepy person with, you know, the trench coat. Like, that's not who we're giving access to our children to. And it's just like, and that's what makes this so difficult, because, you know, the perpetrators are within our family homes, within our neighborhoods, within our churches, within our schools, within our sporting organizations. Yeah. So there is a purpose for a sex offender registry or a check when it comes to employment, or even for us as volunteer services and other things on there. There's definitely room when it comes for that, and that is something that we see that we would need. But, you know, when we're talking about public sex offender registries, this is something that we really need to look at how much harm it has done in other jurisdictions, because of the fact that it takes away from the reality that when it comes to child sexual abuse, unfortunately, the risk is based on those persons to whom you entrust your children, to the people who you give access to your children. So I think it's about, we need to have this dialogue. We need to have it properly. We need to think this through a little bit more. Cayman has a limited amount of space as well. It's not like we can, you know, tell people that they can't live within a certain parameter and everything else, but there is definitely a gap when it comes to whom we're employing and, you know, who's volunteering and whatnot that needs to be addressed. And so there has to be a better way in which we can adapt this as a tool that will help us and not make us more vulnerable. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in after that, but.
Oh, can I weigh in just for a second? I feel like in the spirit of what you said, Carolina, is that like sometimes some of these registries, you see them around the world in larger places and that sort of thing. But I find that it lulls people into a false sense of security. People think that, I mean, very much like people with bad credit, right? Let's use that as an example. You know, you're not going to lend somebody money unless you can check their credit score or some kind of credit registry, and then that, oh, well, I checked that credit registry and that makes them okay, I'm going to lend them money. But, you know, when when you're talking about sexual offenses against people, adults, children, whatever, people think, oh, okay, I checked the sex offenders registry, they're not on there, so yeah, I'm going to leave my child with them, and it's going to be okay. So there's, there's that aspect of it, is that I think it's too much of an out, as far as there's one way to, you think, oh, okay, well, they're not on the registry, it's okay. It lulls us, as I said, into a false sense of security, because the stats are right there. Anybody that has children or cares about children should do the Darkness to Light program. It'll show you across the board that, like you said, 90% of the time, it's someone that the person knows and trusts that gets somehow access to them and then can perpetrate against them. And, sex offender registries are only for those that are reported, convicted, and pursued, etc. And the stats, again, do not show that or reflect that people are prepared to do that for a variety of reasons that we've already covered.
I appreciate that, Cindy, because absolutely, and I think you raise a good point from the perspective of it's important for us to embrace the fact that there isn't any one single magical thing that we can do that will do the work for us. It's not the sex offender registry. It's not even going to be, having the national standards. It's not going to be ensuring that you have this policy. Child protection and child safeguarding is a choice that you make every single day, and it's going to take work. So you have tools that make those things, that makes the environment safer for kids. So the offender registry is a tool, the training is a tool, the policies are a tool, the laws are a tool that they kind of end up coming together. But there isn't one single magical thing that once you do it, it will be poof, like kids are going to be protected forever. No, it's a choice that we make every single day, and it takes work, and we need to be willing to put the work into it.
Okay, I think it's time for the last question. And I think this is one of the most important questions, is that people who work in a school setting or kindergarten setting or with children, is there any way that people like that or work in those settings can be of help with the campaign in the community? And I think, Carolina, this is on you to answer. How do people who work in settings with children can promote this information, can raise awareness, can get trained?
So I think we've been talking quite a lot about Darkness to Light Stewards of Children. That is a training session that we offer free of cost on an entirely virtual platform now because of COVID, that you are able to access once you are living in Cayman. I'll put up a slide with my email address at the end. But I think that the other aspect of it as well that we need to remember is that we all have spheres of influence. Yeah, we all have groups of colleagues and friends and other persons with whom we interact. Fellow, like Cindy was mentioning, the mommy groups, or it's like the friend groups and whatnot. One of the biggest things that people can do in terms of coming together is to actually raise awareness, is to talk about it. So when it's just like, someone asked me earlier about, well, do you do these presentations with, PTAs? And it's like, we do. And it's like, we have over the years. And it's like, the school administration doesn't change very often. The PTA changes a little bit more. So, as the new people are coming in and out of PTAs, and it's just like the people who are there who see the need for this information to be shared again and again, you are the constant. Invite us in. We'll come in. We'll do things with your groups. So I think it's all of those things. And I do have a sort of, as we're going to be wrapping up shortly, I'm sure, I do have a little slide when it comes in terms of the call to action and what it is that people can do. But definitely, the biggest thing that we need to start with right now is, start by raising awareness, start by talking about these things. If any of these statistics shocked you, yeah, and it's just like, and I'll give you one that should be shocking, 3% of 955 kids said that their first sexual experience was before the age of 7. Yeah, I don't need you to just be angry about this. I need you to want to do something about it, because anger will just burn your energy and fizzle it out. Like, you need to be, okay, well, what can I do to ensure that for within my sphere of influence, within, you know, the 5 kids or 10 kids that I interact with, or 100 kids, or whoever it is, that we are doing our part to keep them safer. So I want you to feel motivated by this to actually take action in some way, shape, or form. So educate yourself, talk about it, and, you know, and it's just like, and sure, be in touch with us. That's what we want. We want more people to find out in terms of what can we do, and we will work with you within your context to see what makes the most sense, because this is essentially how you start a movement and how you start a shift in culture.
If I could jump in as well, like just through our workplace. So we deal with employees and we deal with companies in the corporate world. And so through our nonprofit, we have different companies that are doing mentoring programs, or doing various programs, coaching, whatever it might be, with children. And so they're making it a part of their safeguarding training within their companies, not only people that are, you know, volunteering, but also just employees of the companies that have children or want to know more about how to protect children. And so for us with EAP, we're offering the training, the Darkness to Light training in person, within the venue, within the company. So everybody's in their bubbles. And of course, it's simply the cost, as we are a nonprofit, the cost is for the booklets and for, and that's it. We're making ourselves available to ensure that every adult in this community, in this country, is taking this seriously. And we're not limited, you know, you're not limited to, oh, you know, I don't have time on the weekend to go to a training, or, oh, I don't know, you know, a lot of the corporate world is taking it seriously. They're giving their employees time to do it. So we all need to, it's the best 2.5 hours of your life, maybe 3 hours to spend. And if you care about children, you need to do it. And there's no limit, you know, there shouldn't be any barriers when it comes to protecting children. I'm sorry.
Sorry, can I add one? So, and then it doesn't have to be like a big, so by taking a training, it will make you aware to spot small little thing. And it doesn't have to be, it's hard to spot, oh, this person might be sexually abusing this child. That's very hard to spot, and then you shouldn't be assuming those stuff. But small little things like playing like a little nasty song at the public beach when kids are around, or like inappropriate clothing in front, like where kids are, lots of kids are around you, and then again, too much sexual dance. Those needs to be stopped. And if you see it, I want to tell people that I don't want you to do that in front of my child. I think that's okay. And then that will make more people aware to kind of tone down those cultural, like sexy is okay, but it's not okay anytime, anywhere.
Yeah, like you said, Mari, like making it a part of the conversation. You know, I love being the unpopular person at, you know, chat parties or groups with other people with their children. I love being that person that asks those questions, because, you know, we say, I don't want you to tell that joke, or I don't want you to, you know, that's not okay that you play that song in front of my child. And so that makes the way for other people to be a little bit braver to question in the same way. And if we all start to question it together, then, you know, there's strength in numbers, right?
Yes. So do any of the panelists have any final thoughts that they would like to share? Sophia?
I think just that there's a tremendous amount of work that's gone into what PSH has done over the years. It's not any single entity, but it's been a unified work in the areas of specialty that exist here in the working group. It certainly isn't that we think we know it all, but it's a conversation that we want to keep having about how to keep children safe. If you think about it just simply, if we have broken children turn into broken adults. And it completes a cycle because someday those broken adults that we didn't take responsibility for as children are in charge of us. I mean, if you want to just look at it very simplistically in terms of completing of a cycle. But I would hope that more than, just not wanting to be left in the care of broken people, that there's just a love that we have for children, that we want to see them grow up whole. We want to see them grow up healthy. And so I think that the bravery sometimes that maybe needed to stand up and say things that might be unpopular. I don't think we're asking adults to do anything more than we expect of kids when we tell them to stand up for things, within their peer group. And if we model that for them, then we make a really good model for the future. So I feel like all of the many things that come together to make us a safe environment for children, it's a hands together type of work. And I hope that, as so many of my workmates have kind of said, that if you aren't really sure, or this just seems to be going over the top of your head, or even if you think you know it all, if you haven't done Darkest to Light, do that. If you think, well, maybe there's another better way, have a conversation with us. If you wonder what all the hoopla is about in terms of, camps and, should I take my kid to this particular arts program? If you think about those statistics that have been shared, it makes it harder to just kind of take that kind of nonchalant attitude towards it. It takes daily choices, as Carolina has said, daily choices about how do I ensure safety? How do I promote safety for my children? So I really hope that those who have been listening that maybe aren't aware of the work that's been done would reach out and ask some questions. Even if they seem like tough questions, I think that we're tough enough to kind of to stand and answer them. So those would be my last comments.
Thank you, Sophia. Camila, would you want to say some final thoughts?
Sure, I don't have very much to say. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I'm grateful to have been a part of this project since it started. I'm happy of all the gains that we have had from education that we established through this partnership. And I just want to echo what both Sophia and Carolina said. It's great that we have people who are engaged in this process here and watching this Zoom meeting this evening. But what is your takeaway from this? It's important for people to think about what actions, what steps are they going to take so that they can help be part of the solution, instead of just closing your eyes to it after you attend the meeting tonight, and then you say, okay, that was really interesting, and then you forget all about it, right? So we just want to encourage people to really think about what role they play in achieving the goals we want to achieve, which is to protect and safeguard our children.
Thank you, Camila. Laura, would you like to say something?
Sure. I think it just reminds me also, and reminds people who have small children, if they're at a nursery or preschool, if they've gone through and had the Bobo and TD, My Body is My Own, reminds me to look through it again with my kids. And if they haven't, then maybe bring it into the nursery or the school. We did presentations in to private and public nurseries, and it was very well received. Talking, I think Carolina and Cindy mentioned, it's like a cycle, but the educators also enjoyed the program itself, and it helped them give them the tools to speak correctly and freely. So hopefully it does to parents as well. So if it isn't something that you are aware of, then definitely reach out and make yourself aware.
Thank you, Laura. Sydney?
Have I said enough? Honestly, I just think, let's just keep talking about it. Let's just keep talking. Ask us, talk to each other, talk to other people that care about children. Let's just keep the conversation going. And I know it's been, through the years, the work we've been doing has been We've seen a lot of changes, a lot of progress. We've pushed a lot of buttons over the years, but we need to keep pushing. We need to keep pushing buttons. Everybody that's on here tonight, hopefully at least one person, you'll tell them tomorrow about something, about participating in this tonight, and that'll spark a conversation, from there. Or at the very most, you think, sometimes if you just mention, even, that you attended something like this, you mention to it, then you're planting the seed for someone to, if they get curious about something, or, they notice a red flag in some, in a child's behavior, and they think something's not right. If we're all watching, if we're all helping, then, it just stems more further conversation. It normalizes the discussion instead of it making it this big, scary taboo within the community. So I guess that's the long-winded version of, let's just keep talking about it. Let's keep doing what we're doing, and let's get more people on board.
Thank you, Cindy. Mari?
Yes, same as Cindy, we just need to not ashamed to open our mouths to talk about these topics. Sharing information helps to kind of understand each other. Sorry, I just got distracted by my son. Sorry. Yes, I had something I wanted to say. Well, yes. And then I don't want people to feel like oh, that's such a big thing that I have to do. It's not. You can start from small little things.
Thank you, Mari. Carolina?
Okay.
You're muted.
Yes, I saw that. Thank you. I guess it will just wrap up from the perspective of our little call to action slide. So, in terms of what can you do, there actually is quite a bit that you can do. And as Mari says, you can take it as big and as small a step as you want. So learn the facts about, things like child sexual abuse. Again, our Stewards of Children training is available free of cost to members of our community. Talk about it, if there was something that stood out to you, something that moved you, something that you couldn't believe about what you heard about here today, share it with your family, your friends, and your coworkers, because that's how, the more people talk about it, the more we move the issue forward, because it then becomes something that is at the front of people's minds. Ask questions of the organizations that you are involved with. So if you are a parent and you put your child in a youth serving organization, whether they're doing yoga or dance or music lessons or some kind of sports or acting or anything else, ask questions of that youth serving organization. Ask questions of the organizations that you volunteer with. As a volunteer with a child, do you know that you're a mandated reporter? Do you understand that you have a responsibility in the law? Is there a code of conduct in your organization? Do you know how to report suspicion, discovery, or disclosure of child abuse? Because there is that positive responsibility that would be put on you as someone who has a duty of care towards a child. So, if you are a beneficiary of any service, right? And it's just like, because we have to empower everyone. If you're a beneficiary of a service, and it's like, it doesn't matter of the fact that, you may be getting the service free of cost, or might be through a referral and whatnot. You have the right to ask questions of the people who are providing services from you, and it's just like, and ask those questions. So so make sure that you do that, and you start the dialogue. And of course, for us, engage your MPs, engage the people who are there to help make the laws, who are there to move policy forward. I told you I was a broken record, and there it is. There are no national standards for youth serving organizations in the Cayman Islands, and we cannot accomplish this without visible community support. There's nothing that I would like more than to come back here in December and to say we have gotten national standards for youth serving organizations. That would be the biggest accomplishment for our 10th anniversary and whatnot, but we need to come together as a community and start asking those same questions, not necessarily just of the people on the panel who are limited in what they can do. We've done some pretty cool things, but we're still limited when it comes to what we can do, but of the people who actually can make the changes at a national level. So that's what what I would put forward when it comes to this. So with that, I think, Ayala, I will thank you for your time in terms of moderating this. I know we have gotten some additional questions that we couldn't get to. We will take the time to collect those and try to see if we can offer different types of communications on our social media, and perhaps we'll do another one of these to be able to answer those questions. We appreciate all of you who have come here on our Zoom call, or who are on Facebook streaming this live. Thank you to our partners, both those who are in the room and those who have streamed it. And I will leave this up for a while so that you can see it. If you need to get a hold of me, deputy@redcross.org.ky, or you can log on to the Red Cross website as well. Thank you all so much for coming. We hope that this was helpful to you. Thank you for our moderator and our panelists, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday.